and welcome to another edition of the Soft Skills Salon with your host, Diana Kowarski. In this episode, we are joined by Dr. Haesun Moon, the Executive Director at the Canadian Centre for Brief Coaching, an organization that facilitates positive change through dialogue for individuals and organizations. Diana and Haesun begin by exploring the various ways that empathy has been used successfully and unsuccessfully in the workplace. They conclude their discussion by recommending different models that have been effectively used to solve interpersonal conflicts. Now, let's have a conversation.
Hello again, everyone. This is still Diana Kowarski, and you are on the Soft Skills Salon podcast. That's the podcast where we all learn how soft skills make a difference to work, teams, careers, organizations for each of us. We get to listen to novices and experts and really have a conversation that can hopefully be of value to each and every one of us. Our conversations are based on our Soft Skills Impact Questionnaire. Each of our guests get to pre-select a few of the questions that are of particular interest or resonate with them in order for those questions to serve as our foundation for a conversation. And this episode, we are indeed going to have a conversation with Haesun Moon, Dr. Haesun Moon, who is a communication scientist, educator, and author of Coaching A to Z, The Extraordinary Use of Ordinary Words. Her PhD research at the University of Toronto led to developing a simple coaching model, Dialogic Orientation Quadrant, or DOQ, as featured in the major coaching communities, including the Institute of Coaching at McLean Hospital, Harvard Medical School, where she is currently serving as a faculty member. She also teaches at the University of Toronto and serves as executive director at the Canadian Centre for Brief Coaching. Haesun, I am so pleased that you are here, and thank you for carving out time to join the podcast today.
Hey, thank you for inviting me. I'm so excited. So are my dogs that you might hear soon.
Fair enough. Thanks for the warning. So, Haesun, you selected some questions from our questionnaire, and I'm really interested in us getting right into these questions. The first of which is, where have you seen or experienced empathy in your career? What comes to mind?
That word is quite special for me because I had my own understanding of what that word might look like, sound like, feel like, and so on. And I think in my career, first as a manager for a nonprofit or a social profit organization, I tried this empathy thing as I learned in those classes, leadership classes, and they say, well, you listen this way, you actively listen, tell them that. So if I heard you correctly, so say those stuff to tell them that you are listening. And I did all that. And when I started to study communication science, especially in the field of coaching and therapy, there was this guy, Steve DeShazer, who's a founder of solution-focused brief therapy, who actually said, well, empathy is not something that you build. It's something that you lose. And I'm like, what? So that really turned something for me. So I think I've experienced different definitions of empathy, not necessarily, contradicting or opposite, but deeper or maybe even richer definitions of what that might be.
Interesting. And 2 points that really jump out to me from what you've shared so far. I wrote down, and I quote, I tried this empathy thing. And, in my work with organizations and working professionals within those organizations, I often hear something like that. I've tried this empathy thing. And I'm not so sure about the next sentence or about what exactly I've been trying, but I've tried this empathy thing. And then the next interesting point for me so far in what you've shared has been that there's some evolution around what might be even a definition versus a working definition of empathy. So, Haesun, if I asked you to think about the idea, and I'm borrowing this from a few of my previous podcast guests, in fact, more than a few, who have suggested to me that empathy actually begins with self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of that?
Oh, I really agree with that, especially, well, I'll tell you a story.
Sure.
When I was working as a manager in a social profit organization, my manager sat down with me for one-on-one, and I was having such a hard time. And her name is Irene, and she said, "Hey, son, you know that my job is that it's my job to make sure that you succeed in your job. So tell me how I can support you through this." And I found it so empathetic, and wow, that I felt so close to her. I knew that she cared for me, and I love that line. So I borrowed that line. So then I went back to my team. And there was one staff member that I didn't quite like. And I actually thought of as not really performing and all those judgy things that I was thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat down with her for my one-on-one, and I borrowed that line. And I simply said, well, it's my job to make sure that you succeed in your job. How can I support you? That staff member looked at me straight into my eyes, and she said, "You don't mean that, do you?"
Oh.
And you know what? I actually didn't mean that, Diana. I didn't. It worked for me. So I wanted to do this thing so that it sort of works for whatever.
Yeah.
And then that was a huge lesson for me, how unaware I was with my own assumptions and biases. Going into that meeting, I already didn't like her. I really had this outcome in mind. Mm-hmm. And that really, it felt flat.
Right.
And I think in a way, people talk about your awareness is the beginning point. I really agree with that, because when you're entering into conversation with someone, you bring your assumptions and biases, and that will inform your choices of what you are listening for. So, absolutely, I agree with that.
It's interesting that there was an intuition there, right? That staff member of yours could intuit that you were being disingenuous. You were effortful, but that it wasn't yours, right?
That's right.
I'm often struck in the work that I do when working around, specifically, it happens with business storytelling or with presenting skills, where someone will see an individual, perhaps in politics or in a faith-based community, or even within their own organization, who they want to have as a role model, who they put on a pedestal as the encapsulation of the skills that they're looking to portray themselves and build. And the instinct that many of these folks have is to appropriate some language, or to appropriate some of their body language, even their nonverbal cues. And every single time, Haesun, without exception, when it's delivered, when you are taking on the air of someone else, even though it's been so impactful in its original delivery, it gets diluted and contorted. Yes. Right? And people can sense it. That's not yours.
That's right.
Right. And I don't know if we have a word for that. If you know it, I'd love to know.
I love that air thing when you smell it.
Exactly. We know this is, flattery is supposed to be or mimicry, pardon me, is supposed to be the greatest form of flattery. But when we hear someone speaking someone else's words, we take a mental step back, maybe sometimes a physical step back, or often suspicious. And usually not suspicious of grand, lovely intentions, usually.
It's so interesting that you talk about that, Diana, especially about mimicry, because there is actual research done in motor mimicry when people actually mimic other people's gestures and so on. For example, in communication science. Yeah. And what happens is somebody's actually, let's say, researchers set up the research so that there are people who are carrying out some heavy boxes out the door, and it's sort of a public waiting room.
Sure.
So there are people sitting in the waiting room area, and there are people who are carrying this heavy TV box or something. And then the guy who's carrying it will actually just drop it on their thumb or toe or something.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And then they just drop it. And then they watch see exactly what you just did now. They make this either noise or face, and they make some gestures. So people who are in the waiting room now, we're watching what they do. And they immediately, when they see it, they either go like, or they make this, facial gesture. But then what happens is when the guy who dropped it actually looks at them, that mimicry lasts so much longer, and it gets even more accentuated because that functions as empathetic gesture. But if the guy is not looking, then it quickly goes away. So I think it's so interesting that we humans know how to do that already. And in a way, just that, the gaze window, we call it, when we are looking at each other, or when we see something happen, we just let them know, hey, I see you, I hear you. Oh, ooh. That really is that empathy. Now then what happens is, what I mean by, empathy is not something that you build, it's something that you lose. Like, for example, when you're on the phone with somebody and you realize in that split second, you said something and then you know that they're distracted because maybe they have this like golf game on, on, and they're watching it and they miss that cue. And then, they're not paying full attention to you. Right. Then, you kind of feel that empathy crack a little bit. And that's what we mean when we are not fully there, then empathy is quickly impacted.
Right. There's a depletion. That's interesting.
You feel that.
We do. It's in the air, as you said. It is. I love that expression, the turn of phrase there about the gaze window. And immediately it reminded me of the remarkably sort of melodramatic gestures of professional soccer players who feign that they've been injured and are looking around to make sure the right referee or the right person sees that they are injured, in big air quotes. And when they have made that connect, then, they have broken some limb of but not until that gaze has been met, right?
Oh, that's hilarious. Yes. Or children crying. They are looking for somebody to, watch, and they cry.
Yes, absolutely. And they'll put it on hold or on pause, right? Who's not, no, I need someone to this. Where are they? Yeah, I need that. There's so much in the idea of motor mimicry in particular that I find very, very interesting. Those micro expressions and how there's a cumulative impact, how we try to isolate micro expressions in the hopes of there being a tell, and all of that sort of hocus pocus of the poker approach, right?
Yes.
There's so much in there that's about the cumulative effect, right? About the whole person, whether we have access to the whole person in person or parts thereof in terms of communicating either, online or as we are, or certainly on the phone. That idea, though, of mimicry is so important.
And that kind of microness of our interaction. And I think whether you are, working with your teams and even your family, there are those micro moments that accumulate, as you say, and those micro conversations and micro interactions accumulate, and that becomes culture. And that's what a lot of times people go in and they're like, oh, culture shift. Well, what we might need to shift is those micro conversations that are happening.
I echo that so readily with the connections that I'm often asked to make right now with some of my clients around mindset. And I'm sure you're very familiar with Carol Dweck's work around fixed and growth mindset. And the part that I often ask people to think about is perhaps a variation of what you've just suggested. And I love that the idea of micro expressions accumulate into culture in part. I love that idea, Haesun. The word yet is certainly part of Carol Dweck's approach. And I love the importance of that 3-letter word in influencing language by the impact of the choice in a single conversation that word can have. My other favorite one is that pronoun we, and practicing in a corporate environment, in a team setting. Who is the we that you are referring, or do you ever refer to we? And the skill, I honestly believe, for some leaders in particular, in recognizing that the we is almost never the royal we on part of, everyone in the organization, everyone on the planet who eats chocolate. It's this we right here. And the challenge in that micro expression is that you might not feel that you are a part of that we at the moment, and that you're trying to deliver feedback. I know feedback's on our agenda. I want to get there. But if you're delivering feedback, it can be remarkably tempting to disassociate self in order to validate some observational status, when if you can get yourself in there instead, and we can be on the same side, right? And that part, I spend a lot of time walking around with clients, because it is a micro and nano itty bitty little tiny change. However, the cumulative effect of those conversations, I think, are almost immeasurably important.
That's so interesting, Diana, that you actually pick up on that word we, because that was a shift that I actually had to make when my family moved from Korea to Canada, which is quite different culture, actually. So it's Korean culture, which is highly collective. And you go out and you go out to play with your friends in the playground, and everyone, all the adults around you, they're your uncles and aunties. So very collective culture. And when we actually moved here, I had to those are some of the micro expressions that I had to learn, changing from we to I.
Yes.
Because even in our language, what happens is, even if I am the only child, I will never address my mom to another person as, oh, this is my mom. It's just not in our language. Even if I am her only child, I will say, this is our mom. This is our mom. So
I love this, Haesun. I'm a big proponent for the worldview we often underappreciate in language, and the use of pronouns is perhaps a bit particular. However, there's a world of relationship and an orientation of self versus other, or self and other, whomever self or other may be, that we try and represent with these little tiny pronouns.
Absolutely. We as humans, as relational beings, as Kenneth Gergen would actually call, and we are all interconnected. And even in that language, there aren't that many times when you will say, this is my country, this is my mom. It's always our country, our company, our. So even still, when I actually email people, so, we can provide you with, I'm like, who's we? Actually, in this case, this is I. So it's really interesting that how do we, that shift from we to I and I to we, and there's so much in there, right?
There really is. I agree with you. And if we think about that shift, and just going back to the original question around empathy, there's, I think, a role for that shift, or whether someone has engaged in recognizing that there can be a shift, right? Because that's part of the assumption here, is that there is that choice. I do believe that there is that choice there. And I also believe that not everyone sees it. Does that resonate with you?
And I think the choice actually could be also deliberate. So when we're listening to somebody's story, we naturally resonate with misery. And it's just because we have that negativity bias, and it actually serves us really well to survive as a species. But that intentional choice of listening to what they care about, what they want, beyond their just complaining and so on, but what do they care about? And if we can resonate on that level, because, dreams and dread, they have similar magnitude. They're just different in the frequency, and which frequency do we actually resonate with? And wouldn't you want to talk to somebody who really resonate with what you care about, what you dream about, what you want versus what didn't work, your mistakes. And I think that is where we can make a choice of what we are listening for in the same narrative.
Mm-hmm. And that fine tuning of listening is partially where many of us believe that we establish rapport, right? Many of us are convinced that we are establishing rapport and intimacy based on whether someone has chosen to share any of their dreams versus their dreads. Because of that negativity bias, we're quite generous with dreads. Anybody? Here you go. Want some? You want some? I'll give them to anybody. I got lots of them. You got some too? No problem. But to share dreams and to converse and to perhaps even disclose one's self-talk around dreams, there's this connection to rapport and to perhaps a solidarity in that relationship that you can't get via dread alone.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
Can't get there. I often remind people, if you've ever said something like, oh, when I'm with them, I can just be myself, or I can, limit my self-censor, or when I'm with them, I just let it all hang out. Well, what does that mean? Right? What is actually going on there? Right? What is the frequency? What are the cues that you have been responding to? And what are the social risk factors that you've either mitigated or you're willing to engage in? Because some of what you might disclose might be remarkably controversial, yet you've decided that this is a space in which I can do that, right?
Oh, absolutely, Diana. I'm sure you have some circle of friends who you can do that with. I have like a dear friend of mine, Jenny. She's like an award-winning author, right? And then we just check in regularly. And she sent me this. She needs to now like send in her bio. And she sent me her bio and said, this is my bio one with all her accomplishments and amazing thing. And then she sent to me, this is my bio two. And bio 2 was filled with her struggles. And she's like, I'm barely surviving. And it was hilarious. And then I was so inspired to send her my bio 2. Here's my second bio. I sent her, I secretly actually fear this and this and that. And I sent it to her. And it was so freeing. And we were laughing for half an hour. And that kind of relief is very special with certain people in your life.
It is special, and it's
Absolutely.
not, yes, and it's negotiated. I think you've done a really great job of just giving that as an example. It doesn't happen spontaneously, right? That's not how we do that.
Accumulated, absolutely.
Another piece that doesn't happen spontaneously actually takes us to another question, if I may. And the next question that you selected was one that I like to clarify along the way. So if I may, the question reads, what is your favorite way? You'll notice, Haesun, it's not asking for a way or any way. It's asking for your favorite way, which is quite intentional on my part. What is your favorite way to solve interpersonal conflicts or problems on your team? So you'll notice it also doesn't say manage conflict. So I like to be transparent. However, I'm also very keen on us knowing what we're getting into. So what is your favorite way to solve interpersonal conflicts or problems?
Screaming and yelling always works. Like blaming and finger pointing. No?
Oh, and the finger pointing, of course. Yeah,
you forgot about that. Oh, Diana, it's actually, there is this one. I learned it as an activity, but I now use it every single time that we either sense a conflict or I know that there is a possible opposition even happening.
Yeah.
And it's called a rule of summary. And I think it's actually informed by Carl Rogers and also solution-focused brief therapy. And rule of summary is this: you and I, let's say we are having a conflict. Then we have a rule that, Diana, you're going to tell me your side of the story. You and I are having a conflict. We're not talking about somebody else's conflict.
Yes.
But as an agreement, you and I will actually have a chat. So Diana, you're going to tell me about how you see this. And after you tell me, I will actually then summarize what I heard. And as I summarize it, you can actually say, yeah, you got it. Or, you know what, actually that part you didn't get. then I need to summarize it until, you are more or less actually contented with how I summarize it. And only when you say, yeah, that's actually what I said, then I can then move to, I can tell you now my story, and you do the same. And that rule of summary has been so powerful with some of the most controversial topics that are sometimes irrelevant to work too. Some political things that we don't agree with. And I mean, there was actually a conversation about anti this and pro this. And when we sit down and actually say, okay, so you're anti this, so tell me about how you see this. Sometimes it's hard to sit through. And then my job is to summarize it. And we just take turns like that. And it's amazing how after about a couple turns, that whole conflict, the energy level is much calmer because I feel understood. And they know that I understood them too. So that's my favorite way.
That's a great way. And I can tell you, while I have heard of and done a little reading, I have not practiced this as an activity. I often, in thinking about conflict and its solving and or interpersonal conflicts, I ask people to think about calm, which is one of my favorite 4-letter words. I tell people, not often the one that they come up with. Pardon me. However, calm. And so as soon as you walked me through how to live the rule of summary, I hear a road be paved to calm. And if I summarize what I have heard, well, there's a few insinuated choices there. I have listened. I have perhaps even checked my own want to prepare what I'm going to say next in my thoughts and my self-talk.
That's right.
Right? I've done some self-censoring there. I've then got to formulate language where, pardon me, I'm either giving you back your own language, and we love our own words. How, oh my goodness. There's nothing sexier. I said that and you said I said that. Wow, do we love our own words? Or for you to put your own interpretation around, that opens up another roadway to calm. And as you said, you can't not be not understood, at least some degree of there being an understanding. What I like about my appreciation of what you've said, as well as the little bit that I've known prior around the rule of summary, is that it's not actually looking for a point. Well, now we are both going to wear purple. It's not looking for a conclusion, right? It's not looking for a particular intersection. It's looking for people to feel heard and participate quite actively, right? And then hopefully, as you suggested, the energy dissipates and so on. And we move forward. So let me throw a bit of a provocative twist, if I may, Haesun.
Yes, please.
What if one person won't play?
And I think that's the piece that sometimes they will say, I don't want to play, maybe. Well, that never really happened to me, but I can see when that could happen. Yeah. Then we can always turn it to the person and say, so what would work for you? Right. For us to actually maybe address or resolve this, because we must have some ideas about how you might want to do that. So then really, I think engaging the person, if they don't want something, then they usually have something that they want instead of that.
Right.
And I think really listening to what will work for you and what would you like to do instead, without actually sounding like, so you tell us what you want to do then, right? So I think that will be very important to engage. Even that I don't want to play is part of the equation. So you don't want to play. So what would actually work for you instead? I think that will be important.
I think you're absolutely right. I'm reminded of a colleague of mine who I've had the privilege of working with recently, who's based in the UK. And in a similar field, I like to think, Haesun, that you and I do somewhat similar things. I hope that that's reasonable. And in the UK, in corporate settings around communications training, historically, there's been a real difference of interest in comparison to North America to using references to NLP or neuro-linguistic programming. And I'm not sure of your interest or disinterest in it, and we can certainly talk about that in a second. However, I wanted to couch this next comment as he is very much of the NLP expert status, and he gave me a little morsel when we worked together recently. And one of the approaches that he uses based in NLP is to ask someone, especially on the heels of what we've just tried to unpack, if someone is unwilling or perhaps a bit discouraged in looking to how to resolve a conflict, the NLP approach would be to ask a question that asks someone to hypothesize if they did know the answer. So, for example, if I said, what would you like to do to move this forward? And the person responded with, I don't know, or I don't care even, or I'm not sure. Then my response can be, what would you say to me if you did know? Or what would you say to me if you did care? Or what would you say to me if? And I like that avenue to bringing people to maybe in a more psychologically safe environment to have some disclosure and yet at the same time some distance, because they're not saying what they do want. They're saying what they would perhaps potentially maybe sort of kind of want,
yes.
Which is an inroads. Does any of that make sense to you?
Yeah, Diana, actually NLP is heavily based on Ericksonian work. So Erickson's, let's say, he's very well known for sort of mild trends for hypnosis.
Right.
And the way that you do that, actually solution-focused approaches too, we do that in a way that we ask them miracle questions. So there are different ways or different expressions. But what happens is, when we're engaging the person and they might say, I don't know, I don't care, or well, that's never going to happen. Actually, the miracle question came about because the client was like, well, I'm in like incredibly, very difficult situation in my life right now. And yeah, I mean, it will only take a miracle or anything to get better. And then the practitioner sat down and she said, suppose. Let's just suppose that somehow this miracle actually have somehow happened.
Yep.
And as you wake up tomorrow, how would you find out that this miracle has happened? And all of a sudden the client says, well, my kids will be quieter and all those things. And all of a sudden the client became so alive and they are so creative because we just supposed. We didn't impose, we supposed.
Right.
And that positioning of our client, just really supposing literally means you actually position them above the struggle, the barriers, and then all of a sudden they see. So I really resonate with, the example that you're giving, that yes, when we can actually ask that question and people will, they will actually have the creativity in them, right?
You use a phrase I use all the time, Haesun, the suppose versus impose. And I like to say that we suppose looking around, maybe even, a full 360, and that we impose looking downwards. So that's I'm a big fan of suppose versus impose. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yes.
And the idea of miracle questions, that is a lovely turn of phrase. And I think there's a psychological safety in everything that we're suggesting here for people to see how they might participate and have much more clarity with what they perhaps are even dismissing as impossible or in big air quotes, ridiculous or
right.
somehow controversial even, and to articulate that in that space. There's
always something that they want. It's not the destination. It's a means to another end. It means to another end, right? And it's not a ridiculous idea, sure. And then suppose you get there, what will be different? And then what?
Exactly.
Yes.
And going back to the idea of trying to look at conflict as a means of interacting that can be solved. The flipping of a switch is often what people are looking for. However, if I hear your words correctly, this is an iterative, not necessarily linear, but it's an iterative process, right? There isn't a, now we are solved. There's no magic banner, or did I miss the ceremony? Is there a now we are solved banner, Haesun, that I should know?
That's so interesting, Dana, because a lot of times we actually focus on resolving and, doing solving issues like anti-bullying and anti-harassment. And how about what we actually focus on creating, conditions around us? Like, let's say, Diana, how do we create conditions of calm so that other things become irrelevant? They cannot really, it becomes incompatible with the conditions that we're creating. How do we do that at work? So instead of actually trying to resolve something that's stuck, how about we actually work on creating a condition where those things are no longer compatible?
Right. That there's an organic means within that culture because of all those micro expressions that disqualifies it. Right?
Yes.
This isn't an option. Why would we want that? It reminds me of one of my choices, or I should say one of our choices as parents, being partnered, was when our children were young, to be very particular about the number of options or choices that were available, be it number of ice cream flavors or number of activities we could do or whatever. And it wasn't until my children were much older that they realized there's 57 flavors, there's there's 18 movie theaters, there's more, and it was a deliberate parenting choice to create an environment where these are the choices and disqualifying other choices. And perhaps it's an extreme example. However, if bullying and or harassment or uncomfortable conversations or antisocial behaviors are disqualified by leaders or team members within their culture, then you focus on what is there.
Yes.
Right. And by default,
what is preferred? Yes.
What is preferred? Exactly. And often what is preferred doesn't have a name. We don't have names for it when we are doing okay. We're okay, right? And we don't teach how to be an okay leader. Perhaps that's the next course you and I should develop together.
I think so. And once you name it, it becomes a thing. It takes shape.
Very true.
Somehow as soon as you name it, it becomes a thing, and drawn to it, it will grow. And that's the magic of it.
Haesun, I am such a proponent. I was literally this morning working with one of my coaching clients who's a remarkably successful woman who's interested in being even more successful. She's quite aspirational. And I literally said to her, have you named the project? Have you named your committee? Have you named that activity? Have you given that a referential title? Have you done this?
I love it.
And she thought it was quite foolish at first. However, after some explanation, I said, this is how you can build a collective work that you've accomplished, which is different than saying, yeah, I did that. You can say, I worked on project 124 and 125 and 126. And now people know exactly what you're referring to because you named it. So
that's right.
For us, I need to name this as a remarkably successful episode of the Soft Skills Salon. And I thank you so much for your thoughts and input. It has been a delight speaking with you, Haesun.
Thank you so much, Diana. And I really hope that there is a second part or third part to this relationship.
I agree, especially since we got through all of 2 questions. So we have more we could potentially speak about, and hopefully everyone will join us as well. Thank you again.
And then I can talk to you for hours.
The feeling's mutual. Thanks again, Haesun.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to another dynamic and informative episode of the Soft Skills Salon with your host, Diana Kowarski. Please consider subscribing to our show wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we also encourage you to visit our website and social media links, which you can find in the show's notes. We look forward to bringing you another episode. And remember, conversation is the currency of communication.
Bye for now.